Hey, welcome to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our latest content.
The air in Dr. Alistair Finch's office was thick and still, heavy with unspoken things. It felt like walking into a vacuum, a place where sound and hope went to die. I sat beside my wife, Elara, on a stiff leather sofa that felt as unforgiving as the situation we were in. The scent of old books and lemon polish couldn't mask the underlying tension, a metallic tang of impending judgment that coated the back of my throat. Elara sat with a posture of perfect, practiced composure. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her face a mask of serene confidence. She was the one who had insisted on this, and now, under the therapist's expectant gaze, she was the first to speak. "Thank you for seeing us, Dr. Finch," she began, her voice smooth as polished marble. "I'm here because I don't know what else to do. The core issue, the thing that's breaking us apart, is Silas's behavior since I went back to my career." I flinched internally at the word behavior, as if I were a misbehaving child and not her husband of 7 years. Dr. Finch nodded slowly, his expression a carefully neutral slate, but his eyes, sharp and analytical behind gold-rimmed glasses, were fixed on me. "He's become possessive," Elara continued, each word chosen with surgical precision. "It's suffocating. It's aggressive." She laid out her case with the efficiency of a prosecutor. She spoke of how I questioned her when she came home late, how I seemed to tense up when her phone buzzed with a message from work. She painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy, a relic from a bygone era who couldn't handle his wife's success. "He monitors everything," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of pained resignation. "My social media, my texts. He constantly, and I mean constantly, accuses me of having an affair with my boss, Garrett Shaw." She let out a small, bitter laugh. "These suspicions, these completely unfounded attacks, are destroying what we have." As she spoke, I watched Dr. Finch's professional neutrality begin to crack. His gaze shifted from me to Elara with a soft, sympathetic tilt of his head. Then, when it returned to me, it was colder, harder. It was a look of disdain, of a man who had already heard this story 1,000 times and knew exactly which box to put me in. He saw me not as Silas Thorne, a man struggling to understand the growing distance in his marriage, but as a textbook case, the insecure husband. When Elara finished her monologue, a heavy silence fell upon the room. It was my turn. Dr. Finch gestured toward me with an open palm, an invitation that felt more like a command. "Silas," he said, his voice a low baritone that filled the space. "Your perspective?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremor in my own voice. It's not coming from nowhere," I started, feeling clumsy and defensive against Elara's polished narrative. "I'm not just inventing these feelings, things have changed." I explained, as calmly as I could, that for months, Elara had been different. It wasn't just the late nights at the office, it was the way she avoided my eyes when she talked about her day. It was the way her phone was always angled away from me, the screen instantly going dark the moment I walked into the room. It was the deleted call logs and the vague, dismissive answers to simple questions. At first, I tried to ignore it, I said, my voice pleading for some understanding. I told myself it was just stress from her new position, that she was just adjusting, but the little things started piling up. The inconsistencies, the way she talks about Garrett Shaw all the time, quoting him, mentioning inside jokes I'm not a part of. Something inside me, my gut, it's just screaming that something is wrong. "Oh." I looked at Elara, hoping for a flicker of recognition, of the woman I knew. But her face was impassive, her arms crossed over her chest. She had a faint, almost imperceptible smile on her lips, the kind of smile one wears when watching a pathetic, predictable show. Dr. Finch leaned forward, his fingers steepled. The biting tone I had dreaded finally came. "Silas, what you call gut feeling, we in my profession often identify as projection. You're feeling insecure about Elara's success, so you project a narrative of infidelity onto her to justify your need for control." His words landed like daggers. Each one was a perfectly aimed psychological term that stripped me of my own reality. Projection, insecurity, control. "You represent a common, yet destructive, archetype in modern relationships," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "The man who feels his masculinity is threatened by a powerful woman. You're trapped in an outdated model where a husband believes he has ownership over his wife. Your behavior isn't just damaging, Silas. It's toxic." I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked at Elara again. This time, she wasn't hiding her expression. A look of pure triumph washed over her face as she watched the therapist dismantle me, piece by piece. He insisted that I was the problem, that she was the victim, a woman being suffocated by a man who couldn't respect her freedom. I sat there, absorbing every word, every accusation. I didn't argue anymore. My expression became impenetrable, a blank wall against their assault. The silence that followed his final pronouncement was deafening. Ilara and Dr. Finch both looked at me, waiting for me to break, to apologize, to surrender completely. Finally, I broke the silence, my voice low and devoid of emotion. Maybe you're right, I conceded. Maybe I've taken things too far. I can try to be better. To trust more. The words felt like ash in my mouth. They were hollow, lifeless, spoken only to satisfy the script they had written for me. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked out of the room without another word. Behind me, I could feel their shared look of victory. They believed they had won, but as I walked down the sterile hallway, my face showed no anger, no defeat, only the cold, quiet clarity of a man who now knew he was utterly alone in this fight, and that the rules of the game had to change. The days that followed that first session were a form of psychological torture I had never imagined. Ilara carried herself with a new lightness, a victor's grace. The therapist's words had become her shield and her sword, and she wielded them with a cruel, casual precision. Every small disagreement, every simple question, was met with the same line, delivered with a gentle, cutting smile. Remember what Dr. Finch said, Sai? You need to work on your trust issues. It became her mantra. If I asked what time she might be home from work, she'd respond with a patronizingly sweet voice. Now, that sounds a little controlling, don't you think? We talked about this. Now, if I happened to glance at her phone when it lit up on the counter, she'd laugh, a light, airy sound that made my skin crawl. Control, Silas, it's for insecure men, let it go. During meals, she was more radiant than ever. She moved through our home with light steps, humming while she made coffee, planning weekend trips as if our marriage were a shining example of modern harmony. She talked endlessly about events at her office, about projects she was leading, about the brilliance of her boss, Garrett Shaw. All the while, I sank deeper into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dr. Finch's words echoed in my mind constantly. Toxic. Outdated. Insecure. They chipped away at my sense of self, invisible splinters burrowing under my skin. I would lie awake at night, staring at the dark ceiling, the doubt gnawing at me. Could they be right? Am I really that man? A small, pathetic creature born in the wrong century? The doubt was a powerful poison. It made me question my own memories, my own sanity. But just as I would start to believe their narrative, something inside me, that stubborn gut feeling, would rebel. The memories would rush back, sharp and clear. The forced smiles, the hollow excuses, the way her eyes never quite met mine. With every condescending phrase Ilara quoted from the therapist, my heart beat faster, not with regret, but with a growing, hardening distrust. It felt as if she was reveling in her new role as the redeemed victim. She began to dress with even more care, spending an exaggerated amount of time getting ready before work, always with a theatrical flair. Free women don't need permission for anything, Silas, she'd say, glancing at her reflection in the mirror. That era is long gone. Remember what we learned? She slept like an angel while I tossed and turned, torn between the crushing weight of manufactured guilt and the unshakable certainty that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong behind the facade of peace she displayed. The entire week passed like this. Ilara grew bolder, more confident, parading through the house with a superior air, as if she were walking a victory runway. And I remained outwardly calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. But inside, my mind was a whirlwind of silent thoughts, a storm no one else could hear. And then, the day of the second session arrived. We prepared together that morning. Ilara was especially cheerful, smiling since breakfast, as if she were savoring the thought of what was to come. Today is going to be great. You're going to hear it all again, she said, her tone light but loaded with provocation as she adjusted the strap of her handbag on her shoulder. But this time, I hope you really listen. I responded only with a quiet nod. The calmness in my gaze wasn't natural. It was built, forged with patience over a week of silent suffering. It was the calmness of a man who knew that in a few short hours, everything was going to change. Without another word, we left for the office, ready for another chapter in the silent battle that, in Ilara's eyes, was already won. The decision crystallized in my mind the day after that first session. The humiliation was still fresh, a raw wound in my psyche, but beneath the pain, a cold resolve was forming. I realized I was playing a game where the rules were rigged against me. Words were Ilara's weapon, and psychology was Dr. Finch's. I couldn't win on their turf. I needed something undeniable. I needed proof. The next morning, I left the house early, telling Ilara I was running some errands. There was no fuss, no drama. I drove not to the hardware store or the grocery, but to a part of town I rarely visited, a district filled with small, anonymous electronics shops. I found one wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat, its windows dusty and cluttered. Inside, the air smelled of solder and old plastic. I described what I needed to the man behind the counter, something small, discreet, with a high-quality microphone and a long battery life. He nodded, uninterested in my reasons, and pulled a tiny black device from a glass case. It was no bigger than a sugar cube. Perfect. I paid in cash, leaving no paper trail, no digital footprint. I drove home with the recorder in my pocket, its small weight a constant reminder of the line I was about to cross. A single thought dominated my mind. I didn't need fights or scandals. I just needed the truth. That night, I waited. My heart pounded a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation. While Alara was in the shower, the sound of water drumming against the glass door providing cover, I moved. My actions were slow, deliberate, devoid of the frantic energy of a man driven by jealousy. This was something different. This was a calculated move, a piece being positioned on a chessboard whose outcome I already knew. I walked into our bedroom and picked up the expensive leather handbag she always took to work. My fingers, surprisingly steady, explored the silk-lined interior, past her wallet, her makeup, her keys. I found a small, zippered side pocket, rarely used. With a final, deep breath, I slipped the tiny recorder inside, tucking it deep into the corner where it would be invisible to a casual search. I zipped the pocket shut and placed the bag back on the dresser exactly where it had been. When Alara emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair damp, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, reading a book. I looked up and gave her a small, quiet smile. She had no idea. The next morning, she left for work, humming a cheerful tune, swinging the handbag from her shoulder. She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, a gesture that felt more like a formality than an act of affection. "Don't forget what we're working on, Sai," she said lightly before closing the door behind her. I stayed home that day, serene, waiting. I worked from my home office, answered emails, made lunch. To any outside observer, it was just another ordinary day. But for me, every tick of the clock was a countdown. When she returned that evening, I greeted her just as I always did. We talked about her day, a successful presentation, a compliment from Garrett. We had dinner together. And while she relaxed on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, I waited for my moment. Later, after she had fallen asleep, I crept back into the bedroom. With the same cold, methodical calm with which I had hidden the device, I retrieved it from her purse. It was still there, a tiny, silent witness. I took it to my study, closed the door, and prepared to listen. I sat in the dark of my study, the only light coming from the faint glow of my computer monitor. The small recording device felt unnervingly cold in my hand. For a moment, I hesitated. This was the point of no return. Whatever I was about to hear would either confirm my deepest fears, validating the gut-wrenching intuition that had been branded as paranoia, or it would reveal nothing, proving Alara and Dr. Finch right, leaving me as the broken, insecure man they claimed I was. Either way, the life I knew was about to end. I plugged a pair of high-quality headphones into my computer and connected the device. I pressed play. The first hour was mundane. The sounds of a normal workday, the rustle of papers, the distant murmur of office chatter, the rhythmic clicking of Alara's keyboard. I heard her take a few phone calls, her voice professional and crisp. For a fleeting, hopeful moment, I allowed myself to think I had been wrong, that this whole elaborate scheme was the product of a mind sick with suspicion. Then, a new voice entered the recording, closer and more intimate than the others. "Knock, knock. Can I come in, Alara?" It was Garrett Shaw. His tone was casual, but it held an undercurrent of familiarity, of a scene that had played out many times before. "Of course, Garrett. The door's open," Alara's voice replied, sweet and provocative. The sound of the office door closing echoed in my ears, followed by the unmistakable, soft click of the lock turning. The sudden silence that followed was more damning than any word. It sealed the room, creating a private world for just the two of them. My world, listening from the outside, began to crumble. The silence in my study was absolute as I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath held tight in my chest. "I love that dress on you." Garrett's voice was a low murmur, heavy with desire. "Are you wearing nothing underneath?" like I asked. Alara laughed, a sound that was both mocking and filled with pleasure, a sound I had never heard from her before. "Yes," she replied, her voice breathy, "nothing at all." The sound of his footsteps stopped. Then came the sound that shattered the last remnants of my hope. The sound of kisses, deep and unhurried. The tiny microphone, nestled in the bottom of her purse, captured everything with disturbing clarity. For several long seconds, that was all there was: kisses, soft whispers, and heavy breathing. Then, muffled moans began to emerge, a rhythm of pleasure that left no room for interpretation, no space for doubt. The scene, though invisible, was painted in my mind with brutal, vivid detail. I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, the headphones clamped over my ears, trapping me in their private, sordid world. My heart wasn't pounding anymore. It felt like a block of ice had formed in my chest. This wasn't the hot rage of jealousy. It was the cold, hollow certainty of betrayal. The man they called paranoid had been right all along. The man they called controlling had simply been seeing the truth. When it was over, there were a few minutes of quiet whispers and soft laughter before the sound of the door unlocking and opening. Garrett's voice, now back to a professional tone, said, "See you in the meeting at 4. "I'll be there," Ilara replied, her voice just as composed. I listened to the rest of the day's recording, but my mind was numb. I heard her return to her work, take more calls, sound for all the world like a dedicated employee. The duality of it was monstrous. When the recording ended, I sat in the darkness for a long time. The war wasn't coming. It was already over. It had ended the moment I pressed play. With steady hands, I saved the audio file to a secure folder on my phone, renaming it simply, Verdict. Then I connected the recorder again and wiped it clean, erasing every trace. The tiny black cube was once again an inert piece of plastic. Its purpose served. The truth was no longer hidden in a purse. It was in my pocket. And it was waiting. The morning of the second session dawned gray and overcast, a perfect reflection of the storm brewing within me. But on the surface, I was a sea of tranquility. Ilara, by contrast, was practically buzzing with energy. She chose her outfit with the care of a general preparing for a final, triumphant battle, a sharp, professional dress that was both stylish and severe. She hummed as she applied her makeup, her reflection in the mirror smiling back at her, confident and self-assured. At the breakfast table, her good mood was almost unbearable. "You're quiet this morning, Sai," she observed, stirring her yogurt. "Thinking about what you're going to say to Dr. Finch? I hope you've prepared an apology. It's the first step toward growth." I looked up from my coffee, meeting her gaze directly. I didn't offer a defense. I didn't argue. I just gave her a small, non-committal nod. "I've thought about it," I said, my voice even and calm. My unnatural placidity seemed to unsettle her for a fraction of a second. A tiny frown line appeared between her brows before she smoothed it away, mistaking my silence for submission. "Good," she said, her condescending smile returning. "Today is going to be great. You're going to hear everything again, but this time, I hope you really listen. For your own good, for our good." She adjusted the strap of her handbag on her shoulder, the very same bag. She had no idea the role it had played, the secrets it had carried. To her, it was just an accessory. To me, it was a relic of a crime scene. The drive to Dr. Finch's office was a masterclass in psychological warfare, with Ilara as the sole combatant. She filled the silence with a long, rambling monologue about the importance of trust and respecting a partner's autonomy, peppering her speech with phrases she had clearly memorized from self-help books or, more likely, from Dr. Finch himself. "It's about letting go of the ego, Silas," she preached, gesturing with one hand while the other was on the steering wheel. "True partnership is about celebrating each other's independence, not trying to chain them down with outdated expectations." I listened to it all in silence, my gaze fixed on the passing scenery. I wasn't a participant in her drama anymore. I was an audience member, waiting patiently for the final act of a play where everyone thought they knew the ending. My phone felt heavy in my pocket, a hidden weight of truth. I felt a strange, almost out-of-body sense of peace. The anxiety, the self-doubt, the pain, it had all been burned away, leaving behind only a cold, hard resolve. When we arrived, Ilara walked ahead of me into the building, her posture radiating confidence. She greeted the receptionist with a warm smile, the picture of a woman in control of her life, bravely guiding her broken husband toward healing. I followed her, a silent shadow. As we sat in the waiting room, she picked up a magazine, idly flipping through the pages. She believed I was a man who had been crushed, a man ready to be reshaped in her and the therapist's image. She had no idea she was sitting next to the executioner of the reality she had so carefully constructed. The receptionist called our names, and we stood. Ilara led the way down the hall, marching toward what she believed was another victory. I followed, my steps measured and sure, ready for the curtain to fall. The office felt smaller this time, the air even more suffocating. Dr. Finch greeted us with a curt nod, his expression already set in a mold of professional disapproval aimed squarely at me. Ilara settled into her spot on the sofa, adjusting her dress with a subtle smile, preparing herself for the encore performance of my character assassination. Dr. Finch wasted no time. "Before we begin today, Silas," he said, his voice laced with the same subtle irony as before, "I want to revisit our last session. I hope you've spent the week reflecting, because honestly, what I saw here was the portrait of a man trapped, suffocated by his own insecurity." He didn't leave room for a response. His words were definitive sentences, delivered without pause for defense. "Ilara has made it clear that all she seeks is respect and freedom," he continued, gesturing toward her as if she were a saint, nothing more than what any modern woman deserves. "Yet, you insist on this controlling behavior as if you own her. This is toxic, Silas. And once again, the responsibility for this conflict lies entirely on your shoulders." I watched Ilara as he spoke. She nodded in solemn agreement at each accusation, her gaze calm, her pleasure at my public flogging barely concealed. She was enjoying this, drinking in my humiliation like a fine wine. "You need to grow up," Dr. Finch said, his tone sharpening, becoming more aggressive. "You need to let go of this obsession, this persecution complex. The problem isn't in her behavior, it's in your distorted view of relationships." He finally paused, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms, the posture of a man who had just closed his case. Ilara smiled confidently, waiting for my final, inevitable surrender. I remained silent for a long moment, letting his words hang in the air. I stared directly at him, my gaze unblinking, unwavering. I was waiting for the perfect moment, the precise beat of silence to make my move. "I sincerely hope that today you demonstrate some progress," Dr. Finch concluded, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you ready to take responsibility?" It was at that moment that I moved. With a calmness that made Ilara's eyebrows raise in surprise, I took my phone out of my pocket. The gesture was simple, unexpected. I looked directly at Dr. Finch, my voice cold and steady. "Doctor," I said, "since we're talking about maturity, I have something you might want to hear." "Oh." Without waiting for a reaction, I unlocked the screen, opened the audio file labeled Verdict, and pressed the play button. The sound filled the silent room. It was crystal clear. First, Garrett's voice, a malicious whisper, "Can I come in, Ilara?" Then Ilara's, sweet and inviting, "Of course, Garrett." The doors open, the sound of the door closing, the soft, damning click of the lock. The air in the room instantly turned to ice. Dr. Finch's smug expression froze, then began to crumble. Ilara's face went white. The color drained from her cheeks, as if a plug had been pulled, leaving behind a pallid mask of pure horror. Garrett's voice again, thick with desire. "I love that dress on you. Are you wearing nothing underneath?" Like I asked. Ilara's breathy, pleased reply. "Yes, nothing at all." The sound of kisses, the heavy breathing, the muffled moan. The room was utterly still, the three of us held captive by the irrefutable audio truth. Ilara sat motionless, paralyzed, her confident posture dissolved into a crumpled heap of shame. Dr. Finch was stunned, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes darting between me and Ilara, unable to comprehend the scene unfolding. The all-knowing therapist had been rendered speechless. I let the recording play for a few more seconds before pressing pause. The sudden silence was even more profound than the sounds had been. I looked at Dr. Finch, my gaze hard as steel. "Please," I said, my voice dripping with the irony he had so enjoyed using against me. "Keep going with that piece of theory." His confident facade shattered completely. He began to stutter, his professional voice trembling. I don't. This is." He couldn't form a sentence. His eyes darted to the floor, as if searching for a hole to crawl into. I then turned my attention to the woman who was still my wife. She wouldn't meet my gaze, her head bowed in utter defeat. The woman who had smiled and judged and lectured me was now drowning in the truth. Finally, I stood up. I looked down at the therapist, this failed arbiter of my life, with a tone of pure disdain. "You're nothing but a fraud," I said, my voice low but firm. "By the way," I added, putting my phone back in my pocket, "keep your bill. I'm not paying for today's session." Without waiting for a response, without giving either of them a final glance, I turned my back on the wreckage of their lies and walked out of the room, leaving them submerged in an irreversible, suffocating shame. The door clicked shut behind me, a final, satisfying sound of closure. Walking out of Dr. Finch's office was like surfacing for air after being held underwater for too long. The gray, overcast sky I had noticed that morning now seemed cleansing, washing away the filth of the past hour, the past week, the past year. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel a thirst for revenge. I just felt free. I drove straight home. The house was silent, a space that was no longer ours but merely a collection of objects we had once shared. I didn't storm through it, breaking things in a fit of rage. My movements were calm, efficient. I went to the bedroom, opened the closet, and grabbed a suitcase. I didn't take much. A few changes of clothes. My personal documents. The books on my nightstand. The photos on my desk of my family, of friends, of a life before Ilara had become a stranger. I left behind everything she had bought, everything that reminded me of the life we had built on a foundation of lies. There was no drama, no sentimental lingering. I knew exactly what I wanted, and more importantly, what I needed to leave behind. Within 30 minutes, I was packed. I took one last look around, not with sadness, but with the detached clarity of a man closing a chapter. Then I walked out the front door and didn't look back. I drove to my brother's house. When he opened the door and saw me standing there with a suitcase, he didn't ask a barrage of questions. He just looked at my face, saw the exhaustion and the resolve, and pulled me into a silent hug that said everything I needed to hear. "You're safe here. You're home." The following days passed in a blur of practicality. With the audio recording as undeniable evidence, the divorce was swift and uncomplicated. There were no messy court battles, no drawn-out arguments. Faced with the raw, unedited truth of her betrayal, Ilara's lawyers advised her to settle quickly. I came out of it with most of our shared assets. But that wasn't the victory. The real victory was my name, my sanity, and my head held high. I disappeared from Ilara's life as completely as if I had evaporated. I changed my number and instructed my lawyer to handle all communication. To the world we had shared, it was as if Silas Thorne had simply ceased to exist. But for me, it wasn't an end. It was the beginning. It was the start of a clean life, far from the suffocating weight of deceit and manipulation. Months later, living in a new apartment across town, I sometimes thought about that final scene in the therapist's office. I didn't feel triumph, only a quiet, profound sense of closure. I hadn't needed to scream or shout or lay blame. The truth, in its own stark, unadorned power, had done all the talking for me. One evening, I stood by my new window, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The heavy silence that had once been a prison was now a peaceful sanctuary. I had closed that chapter the only way I knew how, in silence, with dignity, leaving behind someone who had never deserved the trust I had so freely given. I took a deep breath of the cool night air. It was the first clean breath I had taken in a very long time. It was the breath of a new dawn.